Picture this. Earl Charles Spencer steps into a quiet, private room inside Clarence House, and tucked under his arm is a dust-coated velvet box that hasn't been touched in almost 3 decades. What unfolds in the next few minutes essentially tears apart everything the world believed about the last chapter of Princess Diana's life. And before you dismiss this as just another royal drama, you need to grasp the setup, because every small detail here carries weight. This wasn't some sentimental keepsake gathering dust in an attic. This was a box Diana herself concealed inside a false-bottom trunk at Althorpe House, the ancestral Spencer estate, sealed with a handwritten instruction on top that read, in essence, do not open until the crown has passed to Charles and until her sons have grown into men. And Earl Charles Spencer honored that request exactly as written. He waited. He waited through the late 90s. He waited through the 2000s. He waited while both boys got married and started families of their own. He waited through the entirety of the Queen's remaining decades on the throne. He didn't crack that box open until King Charles III had officially been crowned, and that fact alone should tell you something. Whatever was inside wasn't a scrapbook of memories. It was a deliberately built time capsule, engineered to detonate at a very specific political moment. Let me back up and explain how he even stumbled across it, because honestly, the discovery itself is a story worth telling. Althorpe House sits on 100,000 acres of aristocratic real estate, and its library is the kind of room where a single side table might cost more than an average home. Earl Charles Spencer had brought in a restoration carpenter named Thomas, a man tasked with measuring one of the old trunks Diana had used since childhood, the one she kept her riding boots, coats, and old books in. Nothing that anyone had bothered to examine in decades. But Thomas caught something strange in the numbers. The exterior of the trunk measured 32 inches from base to lip. The interior only measured 29. 3 inches were simply gone, unaccounted for, hiding somewhere inside the wood. And here's the thing, when a 16th century Spencer heirloom has a secret compartment nobody in the family ever knew about, that isn't a coincidence. That's a custom job. Someone was paid discreetly and paid well to install a false bottom into that trunk. And the only person in that household with both the cleverness and the motive to arrange something like that was Diana herself. Earl Charles Spencer pried the panel loose with his own hands, which frankly I respect. No calling in the staff, no waiting for appraisers or lawyers. Just give me the tool and let me see what my sister buried away from the world. And resting beneath that cedar panel was a velvet box in deep midnight blue, the exact shade of her famous sapphire engagement ring. And that choice, I'm convinced, was intentional. Diana spoke in symbols. Anyone who spent real time around her has said the same. The color matching the ring she was given when she stepped into the royal family wasn't accidental. It was a visual cue, a message. This is about the crown. This is about the institution. Pay attention. Sitting on top of the box was a folded note written on Kensington Palace stationery in her own handwriting. And the wording is what haunts me. She wrote that if Charles was the one reading this, then she was no longer around to protect them, but he had to give his word not to touch the box until the crown had changed hands, until her sons were grown, and until their father was seated on the throne. Then she added a line that stopped me cold. Only then, she wrote, will the world and my sons be ready to understand what I have done. What I have done, not what happened to me, not what was done to me, not remember me kindly, what I have done. That's an active voice. That's a woman claiming ownership of her decisions. And she was putting those words to paper in the summer of 1997, just weeks before her death. Before we get into what was actually inside that box and the summit that followed, I'd love it if you subscribe to Royal Exposure so you never miss these deep dives. It genuinely helps the channel, and I appreciate every single one of you. Now back to the story. So Earl Charles Spencer lifts the lid, sees what's tucked inside, and immediately picks up the phone to call the royal secretary. Not a solicitor, not a reporter, not a publisher, the palace. And what he says is one clean sentence. Clear the king's schedule for tomorrow and locate Prince Harry, which should tell you everything about how serious the contents were. All 3 men in one room, the father who now wore the crown, the son who would inherit it, and the son who had walked away from all of it to live in California. All 3 of them summoned by Diana's own brother, a man who had spent years openly criticizing the monarchy in public. That alone is extraordinary. The same man who stood inside Westminster Abbey and swore to guard those 2 boys from the institution was now stepping through the doors of that same institution to deliver a message from their mother. Now picture the scene itself. Clarence House, a windowless inner room lined with tapestries that predate most modern nations. The silence in there is the kind that feels physically heavy. King Charles III is standing near the fireplace, twisting his signet ring, apparently a nervous tic he's carried since the darkest years of his first marriage. Prince William stands with an almost military stiffness, jaw locked tight, the posture of a man who's been bracing for bad news since he was 15 years old. And Prince Harry walks in visibly drained, having been placed on a chartered Gulfstream within an hour of receiving the call, hauled across the Atlantic by a constitutional urgency protocol he legally could not refuse. The sheer logistics of that moment deserve a pause. The Crown can conjure a private jet to LAX faster than most of us can hail a taxi. That kind of power is still very much intact, and the tension inside that room must have been suffocating. William and Harry hadn't been in the same physical space in years. The distance between them had been measured in memoirs, in televised interviews, in ocean miles. Then Earl Charles Spencer walks in carrying a leather briefcase. He doesn't bow to the king. He doesn't offer any formal greeting. Just a man carrying something heavy in every possible sense of the word. He tells them plainly that he isn't there to argue. He came to hand them what their mother could no longer give them herself. Then he opens the briefcase, lifts the blue velvet box, and sets it in the middle of the table. The first item he removes is a sealed letter addressed to the king. And I need to pause here, because to understand the impact of that letter, you have to remember what the public story of Diana's final summer looked like. For nearly 30 years, the accepted narrative was that she was unraveling, reckless, impulsive, bouncing around the Mediterranean on billionaires' yachts, chasing risky romances, generally acting like a woman who had lost her grip. The palace never bothered to correct that version, and honestly, why would they? A chaotic Diana was easier to manage in the historical record than a calculating one. But strategic and calculating is precisely what she had become. Those trips to Saint-Tropez weren't holidays. She was using the Fayed compound as a cover to meet privately with Swiss trust attorneys, deliberately going around the palace's legal team, funding every arrangement through her private Spencer inheritance so that no royal accountant could ever trace it. She wasn't running from the paparazzi. She was constructing a legal fortress around her son's financial futures. When King Charles unfolded that letter and began reading it, this man who has barely displayed public emotion in 3/4 of a century broke apart entirely. He covered his mouth. He wept openly in front of both of his sons. And the letter wasn't a rant. It wasn't a list of grievances from a wounded ex-wife. It was Diana calmly informing him that she had put irrevocable legal barriers in place, blocks that prevented anyone, including her own associates, future partners, and financial advisors, from ever laying a finger on William and Harry's private trusts. She wrote that yes, they had fought a bitter war, but he was the father of her boys, and she would not allow anyone to weaponize her name to blackmail the throne William would one day inherit. Then she wrote the line that shattered him: "I forgive you, not for us, but for William's future." The woman the institution had branded a loose cannon had spent her final weeks quietly shielding that same institution from threats it didn't even know were coming. But that was only the first item in the box. The second was meant for the brothers. Earl Charles Spencer reached inside and pulled out a small microcassette tape, tiny, delicate, the kind of technology that feels almost prehistoric now, but was completely ordinary in the 90s. And William was suddenly struck by a memory. He was 12 years old, wandering through Kensington Palace late one evening, and he saw a strip of light glowing beneath his mother's study door. He peeked through the crack, expecting to catch her crying over the latest tabloid cover, and instead he saw her sitting on the floor with a silver dictaphone, the little red recording light blinking. At the time, he assumed she was rehearsing a speech. He was wrong. She was recording her voice so that her sons would never forget how she truly sounded when there wasn't a camera in the room. She was terrified that the public version of Diana would one day overwrite the private version living in their memories. Spencer had brought a vintage cassette player with him, sourced specifically for this moment. He slid the tape inside and pressed play. 3 seconds of static. Then Diana's voice filled the room. Not the careful, breathy voice from the Panorama interview, the real one, the one she used at bedtime. She called them her darlings. She said their names. She told them that if they were hearing this, it meant she was gone, and it meant they were grown men now. And then she said the thing that shattered Harry completely. She said she knew the world would want to call her a victim, but she needed them to reject that. She had chosen her path. Her deepest fear wasn't dying. It was that her absence would turn her sons against one another. She told William that he would carry the crown. She told Harry that his role was to anchor his brother. And she warned them that the institution would try to divide them in order to preserve itself. If you lose each other, she said, you lose me. That was the line. That was the one that broke through. Two brothers who had spent 5 years launching public strikes at each other across the Atlantic looked up, met each other's eyes, and the walls just crumbled. Harry reached out his hand, and William pulled him into an embrace that reportedly violated every royal protocol still on the books. Their father stepped back to give them space, still weeping himself. For a brief moment, that family was whole again because of a 29-year-old cassette tape a mother had recorded in secret, but the box wasn't finished with them yet. There was a third envelope, and this one looked different. No royal crest, no formal letterhead, just a plain envelope addressed to Charles Spencer, written in handwriting that was rushed and shaky, not elegant and measured like the previous letters. And this is where the story pivots into territory that I'm honestly still trying to wrap my head around. Because according to what Spencer read aloud in that room, Diana had received a warning in July of 1997 from a senior intelligence contact whose identity she carried with her to the grave. The warning was this: her global influence was being interpreted as a threat to the stability of the monarchy, and unnamed figures operating outside the palace's official structure were floating the idea of drastic, permanent measures to neutralize that threat. That's the exact phrasing: drastic, permanent measures. She believed her life was in danger, not from paparazzi, not from a car crash, from individuals who saw her very existence as a destabilizing force against the institution itself. And this is where everything rewrites itself. Her response to that threat wasn't to go public. It wasn't to flee to America. It wasn't to make a scene at all. It was to quietly orchestrate her own vanishing. She wrote that she was stepping into the shadows, walking away from public life entirely after that summer, fading out completely so her sons could grow into their roles without the toxic distraction of their mother's chaos. She used a phrase that has stayed with me: giving up my voice so William can find his. She wasn't in Paris that night chasing headlines or enjoying a romantic escape. Paris was meant to be her final, deliberately visible decoy. She was using the Fayed network in secret to arrange off-grid, permanent obscurity. She died in the exact moment she was attempting to erase her entire public existence to protect her son's futures. When Spencer finished reading that letter, King Charles collapsed into a chair. And I don't mean he sat down. I mean he collapsed. The man who commands the armed forces of the Commonwealth could no longer stand because he had just realized something that had gnawed at him for nearly 30 years. On the day their divorce was finalized in August of 1996, Diana had paused in a corridor of St. James's Palace, turned back toward him, and asked, "Will they be safe now, Charles?" He had assumed she meant safe from the press. But standing in that drawing room, he finally understood that she had meant safe from the people who had threatened her. She had been asking whether surrendering her royal title had been enough to satisfy the shadow establishment into leaving her boys alone. She had been trading pieces of herself for the crown's stability the entire time, and he had never once understood what he was watching. So now you have 3 men in a room, all of them in tears, all of them holding the truth Diana had preserved for exactly this moment. And then the conversation shifts from grief into strategy. Because what do you actually do with information like this? Harry's immediate instinct was that they had to release it. The world still believed Diana was a tragic casualty of a car chase. The world deserved to know that she was actually a strategist who had sacrificed herself. King Charles, falling back into decades of institutional instinct, insisted they couldn't. If Buckingham Palace formally admitted that rogue elements within the British establishment had targeted the mother of the future king, it would ignite a constitutional crisis. It would rip the country in half. Harry pushed harder. He said he didn't care about the establishment. She had died for it. And then William spoke. William, the heir, the son shaped from birth to protect the firm at any cost, sided with Harry. He said they weren't burying her a second time, but he also agreed with his father that the palace itself couldn't be the source. So he turned to his uncle and effectively authorized a covert operation. The information couldn't come from the crown. It had to come from the bloodline. Charles Spencer was the only one who could carry it. What followed was, frankly, brilliant. They knew that if Spencer walked the letters into the BBC or handed them to the Times, the government would slap a national security notice on the story before nightfall. They'd seize the originals and paint him as a delusional, grieving brother. So Harry, tapping into his California network, arranged something considerably harder to shut down. They pre-recorded a broadcast and staged it across tens of thousands of decentralized offshore proxy servers. When the signal went live, it hit 50 major networks simultaneously across the United States, Europe, and Asia. By the time British intelligence caught up and tried to kill the feed, they couldn't. The signal wasn't originating from Althorpe House. It was bouncing across national borders through digital infrastructure they had no legal or technical authority over. And William had already covered the legal side of things. Before leaving for Scotland, he had quietly transferred physical ownership of the letters and the cassette tape into the private sovereign holdings of the Duchy of Cornwall. Under centuries-old British law, the government cannot legally seize assets belonging to the reigning monarch or the direct heir without committing constitutional treason. MI5 could not touch the box. Police could not raid the estate. The brothers had fused modern technology with medieval legal doctrine to build a shield around their mother's final words. They had outmaneuvered the same system that had once hunted her. The broadcast itself was devastating. Spencer sat at his desk in the Althorpe Library, the blue velvet box open in front of him, and he stared directly into the camera as it hijacked programming across the globe. Billboards in Times Square, pub televisions in London, newsrooms on every continent. He didn't merely read the letters. He held them up to high-definition lenses so that independent handwriting experts could verify the writing in real time. He played the cassette tape so the entire world could hear Diana's true voice, pleading with her sons never to lose each other. And then he read her final confession aloud, the intelligence warning, the ultimatum, her choice to disappear, all of it. He called her what she had actually been. Not a victim sprinting toward camera flashes, but a protector who had willingly stepped into the darkness so that her sons could stand in the light. Millions of people who had thrown flowers at the palace gates in 1997 began weeping all over again. But this time it wasn't only grief, it was awe. The woman they had mourned as tragic turned out to have been fierce, calculating, and willing to erase herself entirely for her children's future. The whole narrative of her final summer disintegrated, and something far more layered and powerful rose in its place. But the story doesn't actually end with that broadcast. The part that matters most came 2 weeks later, when William and Harry walked into Althorpe together. No cameras, no optics, just the two of them, side by side, walking the gravel path toward their mother's grave on the island in the oval lake. Harry was carrying the blue velvet box. The originals were being returned to her. The digital copies were sealed safely inside the duchy vaults, legally untouchable. But the physical letters and the tape that her own breath had once touched belonged with her. William said she had known exactly what she was doing. He said he was thinking back to the funeral procession, walking behind her coffin at 15 years old, believing he was marching into a lifetime of lonely duty. He hadn't understood then that every step had been paved by her sacrifice. She had walked into the dark to clear away the shadows so that he could one day wear the crown without ever having to glance over his shoulder. Harry called him Willie, the childhood nickname he hadn't used in years, and told him that she hadn't just saved William's reign, she had saved them from themselves. They paused at the edge of the water. William didn't take the box out of Harry's hands. He placed his own hand over his brother's, holding it there together. Harry confessed that he had spent 5 years trying to tear the machine apart, believing he was fighting on behalf of their mother. William told him the war was already over. She had ended it before either of them had grown into men. They crossed the small pontoon to the island, set the velvet box at the base of her monument, and stood there as the morning sun cut through the mist. Two brothers who had been split apart by years of public conflict, standing shoulder to shoulder, exactly the way she had asked them to. So, what do we walk away with here? Because the implications are massive. For nearly 30 years, the world ran on a version of Diana's story that cast her as passive, A victim of a bad marriage, a victim of press cruelty, a victim of a tragic accident. But the evidence she left behind paints a completely different portrait. She saw the danger coming before anyone else could. She understood exactly what she was up against. And rather than confront it publicly and drag her sons into the crossfire, she chose to disappear. She let the world call her erratic and unstable, while she quietly poured concrete around her children's futures and recorded her voice so they would never forget who she really was. That is not the behavior of a woman who lost control. That is the behavior of someone playing chess while everyone around her was still playing checkers. The fact that King Charles openly wept when he read her letter tells you exactly how badly he had misread her. He had spent years convinced she was a liability to the institution. She was actually its most effective guardian, sacrificing herself in ways he simply couldn't see until the proof was laid out on a table in front of him. And the brothers, the same brothers who had been at war for half a decade, who had written books and given interviews that only stretched the gap between them wider, collapsed into each other the second they heard her voice. Not because they had negotiated their way back to peace, but because their mother had already anticipated every move and left behind a message engineered to cut straight through the noise. The heartbreak is that she was right to think she needed to protect them. The triumph is that she pulled it off. She buried that box in 1997, knowing full well she might not live to see her sons grow up, knowing the institution might attempt to erase her, knowing the world might never grasp what she had actually been doing. But she also knew her brother would follow her instructions to the letter. She knew the crown would eventually change hands, and she knew that when her sons finally heard her true voice again, it would draw them back to each other. Millions of people cried during that broadcast, not just because they missed her, but because they finally understood her. The woman they thought they had known turned out to have been someone entirely different, more calculating, more selfless, far more aware of the forces circling her than anyone ever gave her credit for. She didn't die sprinting toward the cameras. She died carrying out a plan to protect her family from threats most people still don't fully comprehend. And the final image that lingers isn't the broadcast, or the weeping king, or the worldwide reaction. It's two brothers walking away from a grave together, finally whole again, because their mother had loved them enough to plan for a future she